welcome back to the dark. They say a man's home is his castle. But what happens when the king of the castle lets something ancient and hungry through the front door? Tonight, we look at the Evans family, and the antique mirror that didn't just reflect their father's image, it replaced him. It started in late October. My father, Richard, was a stoic, quiet man. An architect who loved symmetry and order. But when he brought home a massive, tarnished standing mirror from an estate auction, the order in our house began to unravel. The mirror was framed in a grotesque, twisted iron that looked like melted vines. The glass itself was cloudy, like looking through a layer of dirty ice. Dad placed it in the basement, in his study. He said it had historical value. But my mother hated it. She said the room always felt freezing when the mirror was uncovered. The changes in Dad were subtle at first. He stopped eating meals with us. He would spend hours in the basement, just standing in front of that cloudy glass. When my mother asked him what he was doing, he'd say he was finding the right angle. By the third week, the house began to smell. It wasn't garbage. It was a heavy, sweet, festering odor, like meat left in the sun, mixed with the scent of old, damp earth. My mother scrubbed the floors, but the smell only grew stronger. Then came the night I woke up to get a glass of water. I walked past the basement door. It was slightly ajar. From the bottom of the stairs, I heard a voice. It was my father's voice, but it was layered. It sounded like three men speaking at the exact same time, perfectly synchronized, reciting something in a language that sounded like grinding stones. I didn't go down the stairs. I went back to bed and pulled the covers over my ears. I convinced myself he was just practicing a presentation. But the next morning, our dog, a heavy-set mastiff named Brutus, refused to go near my father. Brutus pressed himself against the back door, whining, his tail tucked so tightly he was shaking. When my father reached out to pet him, I saw his hand. Dad was an architect, his hands were smooth. But the hand reaching for the dog was wrong. The fingers were too long. There seemed to be an extra joint in his middle finger, bending at a sickening, unnatural angle. His skin looked like yellowed wax, stretched too thin over the bone. "Come here, Brutus," Dad said. But his lips didn't move. I froze. I stared at his face. His mouth was completely shut, pressed into a tight, flat line. Yet, the voice came from him. "Come here." It sounded like it was vibrating out of his throat, bypassing his mouth entirely. Brutus bolted. He tore through the screen door, leaving a jagged hole in the mesh, and ran into the woods. We never saw him again. My mother confronted Dad that evening. She told him he was sick. She told him he needed a doctor. I listened from the top of the stairs as she yelled at him in the kitchen. "What is happening to you, Richard?" she cried. "I am becoming optimal," the layered, grinding voice replied. "The vessel must be emptied before it can be filled." That night, my mother locked him in the basement. She slid the heavy iron bolt across the door and told me we were leaving in the morning. She packed our bags. But at 3 a.m., the house began to shake. It wasn't an earthquake. It was a rhythmic, pounding vibration coming from beneath the floorboards. Thump. 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 It matched the rhythm of a resting heartbeat. My mother grabbed a heavy brass candlestick and told me to stay in my room. But I couldn't. I crept out into the hallway and watched her slowly slide the bolt back on the basement door. "Richard," she whispered into the dark stairwell. The sweet, festering smell hit us like a physical wall. It was suffocating. My mother took one step down. Then another. I followed, terrified to be left alone in the dark upstairs. When we reached the study, the room was dimly lit by a single flickering bulb. The antique mirror had been shattered. The glass was everywhere. But my father wasn't standing. He was attached to the wall. His clothing was gone. His anatomy had been horribly rearranged. His arms and legs were elongated, stretched across the plaster like a grotesque spider web. His skin had fused with the drywall, spreading out in thick, gray tendrils. He was no longer a man, he was a living, breathing extension of the house itself. Up the candlestick. She couldn't scream. Her lungs just wouldn't take the air. The thing on the wall turned its head. My father's face was the only part of him that looked human, but his eyes were completely hollow, just deep, black pits. His mouth finally opened. It opened so wide that the jaw unhinged, revealing rows of jagged, obsidian-like teeth. "The foundation requires mortar," the entity spoke, the sound echoing from the walls, the ceiling, the floor. The demon hadn't just possessed my father. It was possessing the house, using him as the seed. Tendrils of gray, waxy flesh whipped out from the floorboards. They wrapped around my mother's ankles. She finally found her voice and let out a harrowing shriek as she was pulled forward. "Run!" she screamed at me. I turned and scrambled up the stairs, my hands slipping on the wood. I looked back just once. I saw my mother being pulled into the mass of flesh on the wall. She wasn't just being consumed, she was being incorporated. Her face pushed through the gray membrane, her features stretching in eternal agony as she became part of the entity's twisted architecture. I made it out the front door and ran into the freezing night. I didn't stop until I reached the highway. When the authorities went to the house the next day, they found nothing. The house was empty. The walls were bare. But I know the truth. They didn't vanish. If you walk into that house today and press your ear against the plaster in the basement, you won't hear pipes. You'll hear my mother, weeping inside the walls. Some homes hold on to history. Others hold on to hunger. When a young family moves into an isolated Victorian vicarage, they think they've found a sanctuary. But the entity waiting in the attic doesn't want their souls. It wants to play house. And it needs the parents out of the way to claim the child. Let's descend into our second tale. Evelyn and Thomas bought the vicarage because it was cheap, quiet, and had a nursery perfectly situated across from the master bedroom. Their son, little Toby, was only 8 months old. The house was grand, but it suffered from a bizarre architectural flaw. In the center of the nursery ceiling, there was a heavy wooden hatch that led to the sealed attic. No matter how many times Thomas latched it, he would wake up to find the hatch hanging open, a square of pitch-black darkness looming directly over Toby's crib. At first, they blamed the drafts. But then, Toby started changing. He had always been a fussy sleeper, waking up crying every 2 hours. But after a week in the vicarage, Toby became entirely silent at night. Evelyn thought they had finally sleep-trained him. But one night, she checked the baby monitor. The screen was grainy, bathed in green night vision. Toby was standing in his crib. He was looking straight up at the open attic hatch. He wasn't crying. He was laughing. Then, Evelyn heard the response. Through the monitor came a voice. It was a woman's voice, soft, maternal, and dripping with a syrupy sweetness that made the hair on Evelyn's arms stand up. "Hush now, little lamb. Mother is here." Evelyn sprinted into the nursery. She flipped on the light. The room was empty. Toby was sitting in his crib, staring at her with eyes that looked too old for an infant. The attic hatch was wide open. "Thomas!" Evelyn screamed, grabbing the baby and running into the hallway. Thomas spent the next day sealing the hatch. He used heavy industrial screws and 2x4s to drill the wood shut permanently. But the house didn't like that. That evening, the possession began. But it didn't take a person. It took the structure. The temperature in the house skyrocketed to a suffocating 90 degrees. The wallpaper in the hallway began to peel, but underneath, it wasn't plaster. The walls felt soft. When Thomas pressed his hand against the corridor wall, it gave way slightly, feeling eerily like a warm, bruised membrane. "We need to leave," Evelyn said, packing a bag, her hands shaking uncontrollably. "Right now." She carried Toby downstairs, but when they reached the front door, it was gone. The heavy oak entrance had been completely smoothed over by the walls. There was no seam, no doorknob. Just a solid stretch of warm, pulsing floral wallpaper. The windows were the same, covered over by the unnatural, fleshy growth of the house. They were trapped inside a living womb. That in. Thomas grabbed a fire poker and swung it at the front wall where the door used to be. The metal struck the wall, but instead of the sound of breaking plaster, it made a wet, visceral thud. A thick, dark crimson fluid began to weep from the indentation. From upstairs, a voice echoed down the corridor. "Thomas. Evelyn, you are upsetting the nursery." Evelyn looked down at her arms. Toby was gone. She hadn't even felt him leave her grasp. They ran up the stairs, the steps feeling spongy and unstable beneath their feet. They burst into the nursery. The 2x4s Thomas had used to seal the hatch were snapped like toothpicks. The hatch was open. Toby wasn't in the crib. He was on the ceiling. The 8-month-old infant was crawling upside down across the plaster, his limbs moving with the scuttling, unnatural speed of an insect. His head spun around a full 180 degrees to look down at his parents. When he opened his mouth, it wasn't a baby's cry that came out. It was the syrupy, ancient voice of the woman. "He is mine now," the thing inside Toby said. "But he needs nourishment. The soil must be fed." The entity didn't strike them down. It unmade them. The walls of the nursery suddenly lunged forward. Ribbons of dark, fibrous material burst from the plaster, wrapping tightly around Thomas and Evelyn. Thomas swung the poker, but a thick tendril wrapped around his wrist and squeezed until the bones in his forearm snapped with a sickening crunch. Evelyn was hoisted into the air. The fibrous vines pulled her limbs apart, stretching her against the wall like a horrific anatomical display. The entity that had claimed the house, the maternal demon that lived in the attic, was ensuring her new baby would never go hungry. The walls began to secrete a corrosive, acidic enzyme. Thomas and Evelyn couldn't move. They could only watch as their infant son, still clinging to the ceiling, smiled a grotesque, toothy grin that stretched far beyond the limits of a human jaw. "Thank you for the harvest," the voice echoed from the attic void. The parents didn't perish quickly. The house kept them aware, kept them awake, as it slowly dissolved them, absorbing their vital fluids into the walls to sustain the thing that now wore their son's skin. If you ever walk past an abandoned vicarage and hear a baby laughing from the roof, keep walking. Do not knock. Because the mother in the ceiling is always looking for new materials to build her nursery. Or we close tonight's journey with a tale of isolation. Out in the vast, forgotten acres of the Midwest, a family inherits a farm that yields no crops. But the dirt isn't barren. It's occupied. And when an ancient, malignant presence infects the family's drinking water, the possession doesn't look like a horror movie. It looks like a sickness that hollows you out from the inside. The Miller family moved to the farmhouse in early spring. It was a massive property, but the soil was black and greasy, smelling faintly of sulfur. The property ran on well water. From the first day, the water tasted strange. It was thick, slightly sweet, like the taste of a rusty penny on your tongue. The father, David, said it was just iron in the ground. But his 17-year-old son, Lucas, drank it the most. By the second week, Lucas stopped speaking. He would stand in the corners of the farmhouse rooms, his face pressed directly against the wallpaper, unmoving for hours. When his mother, Sarah, tried to pull him away, Lucas's body felt cold. Not chilly, ice cold, like marble. He turned to look at her, and Sarah gasped. Lucas's eyes had changed. The whites were entirely flooded with a bruised, murky yellow, and thick black veins spider-webbed across his cheeks. He wasn't weeping, but a thick, dark fluid was leaking from his tear ducts, staining his shirt. He smiled. A slow, agonizing pull of his lips. "The soil is so thirsty, Mother," he whispered. His voice sounded like it was coming from the bottom of a deep, wet cavern. David refused to believe it was anything supernatural. He thought it was a virus. He locked Lucas in his bedroom to prevent his younger sister, Lily, from catching whatever it was. But a demonic presence bound to the earth doesn't respect wooden doors. That night, Lily woke up to the sound of whispering. It was coming from the plumbing. She walked to the bathroom and leaned over the sink. The drain was gurgling. "Lily," the pipes hissed. "Let us in." Suddenly, the faucet violently burst open. But it wasn't water that poured out. It was a torrent of black, greasy sludge, filled with writhing, pale white larvae that smelled of absolute decay. Lily screamed and stumbled backward. David and Sarah burst into the bathroom. They saw the sludge overflowing the sink, soaking into the floorboards. The house was rejecting them. David ran to Lucas's room. He threw open the door. The room was empty. The window was shattered. But the walls were covered in frantic, jagged scratches, spelling out the same phrase over and over in the drywall: "We must be planted. We must be planted." David gathered Sarah and Lily, rushing out into the front yard toward the truck. But as they stepped onto the grass, the ground gave way. The soil was no longer solid. It had turned into a thick, churning mire of black mud and writhing roots. It acted like quicksand, but it was intelligent. Thick, pale roots shot up from the earth, wrapping around David's knees, dragging him down into the muck. "David!" Sarah shrieked, reaching for him. From the darkness of the cornfield, a figure emerged. It was Lucas. But his anatomy was ruined. His jaw hung loosely against his chest, and his limbs were elongated, moving with a stilted, twitching cadence. The entity inside him had completely hollowed out his humanity. He was nothing but a puppet for the blight. "Join the soil, Father," the entity wearing Lucas's face gargled. The roots pulled David under. The mud closed over his head, swallowing his screams. The earth burped a bubble of foul, sulfurous gas, and then the yard was perfectly flat again. Sarah pushed Lily toward the road. "Run! Don't look back," she cried, turning to face her possessed son. Lucas didn't attack his mother. He simply opened his ruined mouth. A swarm of black, buzzing insects, thousands of them, poured from his throat like smoke, enveloping Sarah in a blinding, deafening cloud. The swarm forced itself into her mouth, her nose, her lungs. The entity didn't dismantle her from the outside, it claimed her from within. Lily ran. Her small legs carried her down the gravel road, the sound of the swarm and the sickening crackle of her mother's bones shifting echoing behind her. She made it to the neighboring farm by dawn. When the police investigated the Miller property, they found the house pristine. The well water tested perfectly clean. But in the front yard, where nothing had grown for decades, there were 3 new, perfectly shaped weeping willow trees. Their bark was pale, and their roots pulsed with a slow, rhythmic heartbeat. The farm had fed. The family had been planted. And if you listen to the wind rustling through those leaves today, you won't hear the breeze. You'll hear a father, a mother, and a brother, trapped in the wood, warning you to never drink from the well.